Chapter 10. Early the next morning, the priest came knocking on the pub door. Solemnly they filed out, stepped into the processional formation. All but the immediate families and the pallbearers had gone home hours before, leaving the parking lot, such as it were, empty. It looked eerie in the cool, foggy dawn. It was peaceful. Fitting. Skye shouldered his burden gladly, stood behind Henry at the back of Reggie's casket. Ian had asked him not an hour ago when he had gathered the men together for a ritual shot of whiskey and a final toast to their dead. Reggie's mother had asked for him. Insisted, he'd said. He was honored. Two altar boys in black cassocks and white surplice walked in front of the priest, swinging the censers on their chains. The priest carried his staff solemnly forward, leading the flock onward. As head of the family, Ian walked immediately behind the priest. Johnny and Anne flanked him, walking 3 paces back. Johnny in his black patchwork, with a black ribbon now woven into the crisscrossing braids, and a bodhran drum in his hand. Anne marched solemnly beside him without her shillelagh, her veil falling to her breast, covering her carefully dishevelled hair, giving forth a high, keening wail that carried eerily through the fog. She kept her eyes on Ian's back, trusting her sight to lead her. Then came the boys, carried high on black-clad shoulders. Reggie, Michael, Duncan, and Patrick, followed by the immediate family. Echo trailed along at the rear, reluctant to let the dead out of his sight. They wended their way down the lane, the long way, through the main street of the rest towards the parish church. It was a haunting procession. The drum was heard beating out the time, and the keener's voice carried like a siren through the mist, all heard before the priest could be seen. The curtains and doors of every house were closed, but as the procession passed, people in black filed out of the houses and joined the line. The people who came out of the houses were more than those who lived there, as folk who lived off the parade route had come to wait in the houses of those who did. In this manner they came to the small parish church nestled amid ivy and myrtle trees. At the church steps, Anne fell to her knees beside the door, out of the way, her face buried in her hands, weeping. Johnny took up station on the far side, standing like a statue, still slowly striking the drum in his hand. It was not difficult for Anne to actually come to tears beneath her veil. One funeral or another, it was all the same one. She had walked this road before brothers, a sister or two, both her parents. For some reason she felt those losses keenly this morning. Perhaps because everything was as surreal yet painfully solid as it had been on those mornings. Perhaps it was because she could not remember a single face or name. When the last of the procession had entered the church, Johnny silenced the drum and bent to help her to her feet. She looked up at him, a little lost at first, allowed him to pull her up. Drawing a black-edged kerchief from her pocket, she dabbed at her eyes, discreetly blowing her nose before throwing back the veil and tucking the kerchief away. She walked into the atrium of the church with him. Anne listened, found the door to the sanctuary by the sound of people settling themselves in. Her hand found the small font at the jamb by instinct, dipped her fingers and crossed herself. She slid her hand around the edge of the doorframe, feeling her way along the back wall for the chairs that were always set there for deacons or ushers. She perched on the edge of one, listening to the Mass. As a child, she had found comfort in these places, had loved the colored glass and the music, the rites. The Rests priest had a good voice, comforting and warm, the kind of voice that would be easy to confess to. But his words seemed to have no effect on her. This disturbed her. The little rituals that always gave her a sense of peace and comfort left her strangely cold. She distracted herself by trying to analyze why this might be. It wasn't that she was now one of the touched. She could see many of them in the congregation as engaged in the service as she had once been. She thought perhaps it was the act of having lived in close proximity to older gods and by their laws and dictates for so long that had her just going through the motions, and left favorite parts of the Mass feeling hollow to her. Unable to take it, she rose and felt her way out of the sanctuary, with only the soft hiss of crepe against the floor heralding her exit. The atrium was empty, but the front door was open. She could see the edge of Johnny's arm just outside and reached for the doorway. Stepping out, she saw him sitting against the wall with his drum at his feet, smoking something he did not hold like a pipe, nor did it smell like one. She felt for the step and gingerly sat on the top one, arranging her skirts around her. She turned her face to the morning, could still feel the mist in the air, even though the sun should have burned it off by now. "Is the fog still as thick as it feels?" she asked softly. "Aye, probably burned off in the rest of the village already. But there's a river near, between here and the cemetery. Fog always lingers here." "It seems to like you," he said. She looked over her shoulder at him. He was observing her casually. "It clings to you, seeks you out. On the march here, it was almost like you were the source." She blushed, looking back out into the darkness. "My favourite time of day, when the fog rises. I used to go down to the stream to watch in the gloaming. It always seemed to trail after me on the way in. One of the reasons they called me Banan Ciobran." They sat in companionable silence for a little while before Johnny spoke again. "Why'd you leave the mass?" Her shoulders twitched. "It didn't feel right. It hurt." She heard him move, glanced back to see him leaning forward over his knees. "Physically?" He frowned. She shook her head, and he seemed relieved. It's just, I don't know. I've lost the taste, I guess. The old ways are more appealing, aye. It's not that. I just don't feel it anymore. Mayhap living with the nuns for nigh 2 years had somewhat to do with it. I don't remember my faith being a chore afore then." "What? You thought I might feel physical pain going in?" He leaned back against the wall, taking another drag of smoke. "It has happened." Anne watched the smoke curl in the air above him, making interesting patterns. "What are you smoking?" she finally asked. "It's not a pipe. You're holding it wrong, and it smells different." "It's a cigarette. It's tobacco wrapped in paper. They're cheaper, more convenient than pipes. Why doesn't it smell bitter, like the ones Ian smokes?" "I roll my own. Add things from time to time. Ian buys his, uses filters. I don't. It's a preference thing." "So one more little hint as to your age," he said, with a twinkle in his brown eyes. "Not necessarily. It might have been a city vice at the time. The village was rather poor. We were all beholden to Lord—" She frowned, sighed. "Still can't remember names." "It's all right." He cocked his head over his shoulder, listening to something inside the church. He took a last long drag from his cigarette and rolled the remains between his fingers, tucked something into his pocket, and gracefully rocked to his feet. "'Tis time." He held his hand out to her, and she set her hand in his. This time it was he who commented on how cold it was. "No time for nerves, lass. You're fine. Now this time you lead the way." "Wait, what?" she cried. "But the priest—" "Lead you to church, not from it. At least here. I'll be right behind you. Surely the chief should lead. He's taken his turn as pallbearer. As chief it is his right and expected of him. It shows he bears a share of the burden and the grief. It's his promise to the family. Of course, this time he is family, but that's neither here nor there." He turned as someone came out of the church door, bent to accept something from someone small. "But how will I see the way? I've never been—" He gave a soft laugh. "Don't fret. Timothy here and I have that covered." He breathed on something in the boy's hands, and she watched as frost grew across the surface of a glass lantern. He struck a match and lifted the glass, lit the candle stub within and closed it. The effect to her was a soft glow. "Mr. Smiles here will lead the way with his lamp. 'Cause of the fog and all." The look he gave her said this was just an excuse. "Just follow the light." He crossed to her, began lowering her veil into place. "Is it always this way?" she asked. "No," he said, adjusting the lace edge of the crepe. "We haven't had a banshee for nearly as long as I've been here. My first funeral we had one. The effect is memorable." He held her eyes with his through the veil, seemed to be trying to read things in their foggy depths. "What happened to her?" she asked in a hoarse whisper, unable to look away. "She got bronchitis and lost her voice. We haven't had anyone with the pipes in a long time." He let her go, turning to take the drum Timothy handed up to him. She grabbed his arm gently. "How did you know I'd make a good keener?" He smiled sadly at her. "Your voice." The graveside service was touching. Skye stood at military attention behind the immediate family with the rest of the pallbearers. It was all he could do to maintain his comportment when Anne began to sing Shularoon in her soft, haunting voice. The service done, most people wandered away from the gravesite. Some remained to help as the pallbearers picked up the 3 who did not belong at this grave and carried them to their final resting places. This had Echo in a small fit, unable to see all of them at once. Skye stayed to help lower Reggie into his grave, rolling up his sleeves to help fill it in. Once the dirty work was done, everyone left, migrated towards the big house. Once they left the cemetery and the full weight of the morning sun began to bear down on her, Anne began to flag in the heat. Johnny took her arm and did not let go of her until they were in the main house and on her hall. She assured him she would be all right and went to change into the darkest, coolest clothes she had. She carefully hung her widow's weeds up in the back of the wardrobe, folding the veil and putting it away in its drawer. Shannon had been very clear that she was to keep it as long as she wanted it, and at least as long as she served Keener here. When she finally brushed out her hair, pulled it back, and came downstairs, she found Johnny hovering in the atrium by the flowers again. She could see all the lilies and roses on the side of the table he was standing on. He looked up at her approach. "You look a mite cooler. You going to survive the heat? August in Florida can be mighty unforgiving," he warned. She gave him a shy smile. "I'm as cool as modesty will allow. I'll survive. Cooling drinks, etc. Stay in the shade." She accepted his hand as she left the last step. "Will you be participating in any of the games?" He set her hand on his arm and led her out the back to where all of the festivities had been set up. "I might. I hear they're doing an insult contest this year. And I'm to judge a bardic event." "I may have to watch that." "I'd hoped you'd participate." Anne blushed. "I was meaning the physicals." He shook his head. "I know my skills. I've no need to show off or know that I'm better than any of them. They're skills I don't like to use." She nodded. They stepped off the veranda, and he hailed a small young woman over that Anne had not yet met. There was the hint of raven feathers about her hair, and something bird-like in the bright roundness of her black eyes. She was almost painfully thin, with long fingers and a narrow face. There was a ring on her finger that immediately drew Anne's eye, though she couldn't say why. Even her voice was bright and ravenish, without a trace of Irish. "What you need, Johnny?" "Anne, this is Raven." "Raven?" "Anne Keobran." The girl, who couldn't have been 16, though her eyes said she was so much older, smiled and held out her hand. "The Keener," she said brightly. "Pleased to meet you," she giggled. "Your voice had me in tears, darling." "Thank you," Anne replied politely, unsure if it was truly something to be thankful for. "Raven, I be needing a favour." She turned back to Johnny. "Sure, what is it?" "I have to go and set up for the bardic contest, but Anne needs to be taken around and shown where everything is. She can see anything touched by magic, but not else, so she's liable to overlook the mundane. Would you please help her map the area out? That way she can wander on her own later." "And still have a clue where she is and what to avoid? Got it." "It shouldn't take long," Anne injected. "I just need the general idea." Raven waved the protest off. "Not like I got anything better to do. Well, I do, but I don't like dealing with food other people are going to eat, so I'm trying not to get pressed into table duty. I'll help clean it all up later. I just hate setting up. Besides, Martha gets so particular about what goes where." Anne smiled at her. "If you're sure." Johnny took her hand. His other rest lightly on her upper arm as his eyes pleaded his pardon. "Forgive me for abandoning you?" She bobbed him a curtsy. "I have taken up more than my share of your time as it is." "Thank you. I hope I did well." "Better than hoped." He pressed a cold kiss to the back of her hand. "Till later." It wasn't until he had walked away that Anne realized he had done something to her sleeve. She had braced herself for the heat, only to find it bearable. She looked down where his hand had been to see that he had frosted her sleeve. She smiled shyly, turned back to Raven. "When you're ready, then." "Absolutely." The games were vigorous, to say the least. Anne drifted through the different areas and activities with various escorts, sometimes alone. There were hammer tosses, wrestling, sword fighting, boxing, archery, and even marksmanship. In the afternoon there was to be a foot race that circled the manor and the surrounding woods, as well as a few shorter races and a horse race to follow. There were prizes for the touched and the mortals separately in most of the events, especially where the touched had an advantage. Anne could only see about a quarter of the events, though she did enjoy seeing one particular touched getting badly beaten in wrestling by a mortal. She laughed as she hadn't in years, watching what amounted to her to seeing him rolling around in the dirt, twisting himself into strange and painful positions. Roulette was taking part in what seemed like everything, pushing herself past all sense. Anne stopped to watch her in a bout with Mikey. She was using a metal staff and Mikey his greatsword. Standing on the sidelines with her sister and Liberty, Anne noticed that there was a conspiracy going against Roulette. Liberty was doing something subtle to Solitaire, who was looking a little weak and annoyed, but carefully watching her twin. Anne watched the fight. Roulette was relentless, using the metal of her staff to deliver frequent jolts to Mikey in spite of his parrying attempts. There was something in Roulette's eyes she did not like. She stepped up to Liberty and, without taking her eyes from Roulette, asked in a whisper, "What, pray tell, is going on?" "My sister is going to get herself hurt or killed trying to beat her grief," Solitaire growled. "She won't stop," Liberty added. "She ran the marathon, the sprints, has been in 3 fights, 2 wrestling matches, and 1 round with the hammers, all without stopping. She's going to run herself into an early grave she keeps that up. We're going to stop her. Just as soon as Mikey gets a hold on her," she added, keeping her eyes on the fight. Seconds later, Mikey deliberately took a shocking hit on the back, slid in under the staff to disarm her. Dropping his own sword, he wrapped her in a bear hug and just held on, letting her expend herself in electrical surges. At that point, Liberty placed her hand on Solitaire's shoulder where it met her neck and poured something into her. Solitaire slumped, caught neatly by someone standing behind her, and Roulette went limp in Mikey's arms. Liberty stepped up, began issuing orders. "Mikey, carry her into the house. Put her in my old room. Malcolm, would you be so kind as to follow him with Solitaire?" Henry came strutting up at this point, his crown of holly still gracing his antlers, but the flowers were now well on to becoming small, hard green berries. "What's all this? Interfering with the sacredness of the games, woman? You know better!" She waved him off. "Back off, bucko. This be a matter of saving her from herself. 'Twere the only way we were getting her to stop. It weren't an official match, though she didn't know that." Mikey agreed to it. He was a little taken aback by being so addressed, but as she squared off against him and the floral crown began to become more apparent, he put up his hands and took a step back. "All right, so long as it weren't official." She turned to follow Mikey and Malcolm. He called after her. "Just be back before 5. You have to hand out prizes, my queen." He said the last with a mocking bow. She rewarded his cheek by snatching an apple out of a bystander's hand and pegged him right between the antlers. Anne did not laugh out loud like everyone else, but hid her smile in her hand and turned politely away. She followed Liberty's retreating figure back to the house, using her to stay clear of obstacles and the worst of the crowd. Once at the house, she proceeded on to the solar and reached into a canvas bag tucked behind her favorite chair, containing a ball of thread, hook, and the band of lace she had started. She headed back to the veranda and cast her gaze across the broad lawn and the myriad of activities. She located the Bardic affairs and headed off to the quieter part of the lawn, privately hoping she'd find an unoccupied seat. She didn't, but someone gave theirs up for her. She couldn't see the gentleman, but thanked him, even as she told him it wasn't necessary. She fingered the length of her thread for a bit as she listened to the end of the insult contest and looked around at the people she could see. Skye was there, across the way, nodded to her when they met eyes. There were several of the touched among them, all having a good time. The last contestants were a centaur and a middle-aged mortal woman with a scathing tongue. Her last volley was biting, sending the audience into a mix of shocked silence and embarrassed laughter. The centaur colored visibly, tried to bite back and couldn't. Finally, he tucked one front hoof and gave her an equine bow. "Well fought, Molly Suggins." Anne set her glamoured thread and hook down in her lap to applaud the sharp-tongued woman, then picked up her thread and began to crochet, happy she could work again without fearing she had miscounted or made other glaring errors. She settled back with her lace to watch the bardic half of the competition. She could hear people setting up and tuning instruments, warming up voices. She was counting stitches when she felt the temperature around her drop. She looked up to see Johnny looking down at her with a wry smile. The way his hair framed his face and the sunlight behind him haloed him for a brief moment, he looked positively elven, except for the earth-brown eyes. "Aye?" she asked shyly. "And what will you be doing for the contest, Kilbrannock?" She shook her head, running out a yard or so of extra thread from the ball. "Oh, I think they've had quite enough of my banshees wailing for a while." "Your voice—" He stopped himself, changed tactic. "Will you recite, then? Tell a joke? Something?" She blushed. I couldn't. You should. You should enter at least one thing for the ritual's sake. Bad luck on you don't. You shouldn't have had to tell me that, she sighed. I've been there too long, it seems. So unless you've a mind to try your hand with the fightin', he glanced pointedly over his shoulder at the makeshift stage, which was little more than a glorified pallet tossed onto the ground. There's also a dance competition later, he offered. She took a breath. I'll recite, but I only have the one. I don't remember my others. He flashed her a cocked smile. That one will most certainly do. I'll call you when it's your turn. Anne couldn't crochet any more. She just slipped it back into her bag. She was profoundly nervous. She could hardly pay attention to the singers and the musicians, the tale-teller or the comedian. Even the few other poets were only half followed. Her fingers fidgeted in her lap. Finally, Johnny called her. She rose, clutching Capine tightly, feeling more like she was striding to her execution than a performance. She could not understand why she felt more nervous now than when she had stood and presented the elegy at the wake, or sung as Keener this morning, or even joined her untrained voice to Johnny's perfection. There were only about a dozen people she could see, scattered in front of her, but she could feel more. Johnny sat just off to the side with Gabrielle, watching her, encouragement on his face. She gathered herself, took a breath, and lifted her voice. When ships have left the harbour, 70 sailors on a random sea, floating helpless to distant horizons, hoping for shelter in the lee. When hearts have parted undesired, forced away by others' will, they slowly fall to chaotic pieces, washed away by the blood they spill. When angels leave you loving, the darkness moving in, veiling spaces once held sacred by a heart that's caving in. Such are times when hearts break open, shattered, abandoned and dying, when life it seems just can't continue, ruined where hearts left it lying. When ships have abandoned seaport, 70 sailors strong, following sun path westward, listening to the sea's wind-breasted song. When hearts drift long and empty, half dead to face the heat, love too long an absence from kisses angel sweet. When angels fly to heaven, leaving man in need, hearts break in their attempt to follow where holy feathers lead. Such the time when hearts so broken take up the pieces, and then time to say farewell to angels and take the human side again. Anne stepped off the platform with a graceful swiftness, grateful the ordeal was over. She aimed herself for her lace, waiting on her seat. Picking her work up, she felt for the arms of the plastic chair and sank into it. She felt fully flushed in wake of the applause she could barely hear, so relieved was she to be off the stage. Hands patted her shoulder and back, murmurs of well done and other encouragements. They surprised her, almost as much as the discreet sniffles and not-so-quiet blowing of noses. Apparently, she had moved some people to tears. She sat back and was actually able to enjoy the rest of the performances. It was an hour or more later when Martha rang the dinner bell on the back porch, telling everyone the feast was ready. The comedian, who was the last on stage, laughed at that. "Well, I guess that's my cue to get off stage. Those tables are groaning with food, and it ain't going to be my fault if they break, 'cause I held up the feast. Martha'd scalped me within an inch of my life." People laughed good-naturedly as he took a bow and they began to move off en masse. Someone touched her elbow as she stood, about to offer to walk her back when they suddenly backed away. Anne frowned, confused, until Johnny took the unseen person's place and offered his arm. "May I?" She blushed, nodded, shifting her bag up her arm and Capine to her other hand. "Now that weren't so bad, was it?" he asked. She gave a short laugh. "It was terrifying. I've never recited my own work in public before." "You wrote the elegy." "That were different. Somehow," she insisted. "I don't pretend to understand it. I were nervous then too, but not like this." He shrugged. "You could recite someone else's. Charlie did. That piece he did was in Pablo Neruda. Surprisingly, that would have been easier for me." "Well," he said, giving her hand a pat, "'tis good to stretch your limits." The feast tables were indeed groaning with food. Skye heaped his plate with things he was familiar with and dishes he did not recognize at all. It was a feast of ancient proportions. Across the table he could see Anne beside the bard, watched him help her to select foods by describing them. Stouts, beers, and whiskies were available, though aside from the ritual drink near the end, when Ian stood to exemplify the dead and the reason for the ritual, he noted that An did not touch the alcohol. When Ian finished his speech, the table in perfect unison shouted "Sláinte" and drank. Others continued drinking. An satisfied herself with a cup of tea. After dinner came the music and dancing. There was a full band, so Johnny was not required to perform the whole evening, and took a turn on the dance floor with An, who was flushed by the end, both from the exertion and his nearness. Thankfully, by then he was asked to go up on the stage to sing, giving her time to get herself together. Inwardly, she chided herself for even thinking of reaching above her station, because a bard was well above her station. She was soon lost in the sound of his voice, singing one of the many sad but spirited Irish songs. When he was done, the band began a rousing reel, and An found herself swept up in it, indulging herself in one of the Irish country dances she remembered from her youth, and throwing herself into it. When everyone fell out, laughing and clapping, and the music moved to something slower and more a couple's thing, she found herself off to the side with Roulette and her sister. She looked the former over critically. "You look better," she commented. "Get it out of your system?" Roulette gave her a sheepish look. "Got it shocked out, yes." An put her hand on her shoulder. "The guilt will resolve itself in time." Roulette looked at her, surprised. An smiled. "I know the look. Think you're the only one what's felt guilty about their past." Roulette seemed to relax after that, gave An a hug. "Uh-oh." Something in Solitaire's voice made both of the other women look up. Roulette followed her sister's gaze and groaned. "Ah, foute," she cursed in French. An tried to follow where they were looking. "What is she doing here?" "You know she can't stay away from him for very long," Solitaire drawled. "It was over a year this time, damn it all." An tried to see, caught only glimpses between milling mortals. Finally, she saw Johnny standing off to the side with an unknown woman. He gave her the impression of a stag facing down a wolf, torn between flight and embrace. His eyes were full of pain, like a man who wants a drink and knows he shouldn't. The woman drew An's eyes the moment she came into view. She was breathtaking. She almost shone, giving off a cold perfection, an absolute, artful grace. Her clothes were unseeable, but the sleeves were 3/4, the skirt just above the knee, and the neckline more daring than most here, and highly inappropriate for a funeral, no matter what the era. Her hair hung in perfect waves off her shoulder, coy little ringlets hanging at her jeweled ear, the color an odd dichotomy between the autumn red it was supposed to be and the blonde she had glamoured it to be. As her hand reached out to trace one of the tiny braids An had woven Johnny's hair into, An felt a surge of anger at what she was convinced was a derogatory remark at her handiwork, followed by jealousy of the hand on him. The pain in her heart came as he half closed his eyes and leaned into her palm. The tightness of his jaw was lost on her. She did not realize she had been holding her breath until Bethany came trotting up, out of breath herself. An's hand slipped to her chest, her fingers wrapping unconsciously about the 2 dancing figures around her neck, seeking comfort. She listened, but could not tear her eyes off the pair. "So what does she want?" Solitaire asked Bethany. "I know you were eavesdropping." "Of course I was," Bethany snorted. "And of course you're the first I'm going to share with. I hate the bitch as much as you do." "So what does she want?" Roulette pressed, echoing her sister perfectly. If the voice had not come from a different location, An would have said Solitaire had repeated herself. "Apparently she's asking Johnny to perform at her husband's funeral." "Looks more like seducing than asking," An replied with a bitterness that surprised her. Solitaire groaned. "Which means he'll say yes." "He never could resist her," Roulette sighed. "Few men can, not when she tries," Bethany snarled. "Some even when she doesn't. She doesn't belong here." Something occurred to Roulette. "When did her husband die? She's not exactly dressed like a widow," she added sourly. "That's the worst of it. He hasn't." At this, An finally managed to tear her eyes from the pair. "What?" Bethany explained. "She's in a May-December marriage." "She's a fucking gold digger is what she is," Solitaire growled. Her sister laughed. "And you're not?" Solitaire had the foresight to sound indignant. "No. Well off is just one criteria. I have to actually like the guy to put up with him. And I'd never marry a guy old enough to be my grandfather and deliberately move to cut his kids out of the inheritance. Roulette explained to Anne. She married some old guy with a heart condition or terminal something. Not really sure in what order or what he's dying of. I never really pay her much attention when she's not eyeing our men. He must have taken a turn for the worst. Or she's planning on working him up to a heart attack, Solitaire snapped. She could do it, said Beth. Anne glanced back at Johnny, watched the pain on his face as the woman pulled away from him, and he fought the urge to follow her. Anne turned away, angry with herself for her reactions. Here was concrete proof why she kept her heart to herself. He was tantamount to falling for the lord of the manor's son, and this woman was everything she would never be. So who is she? Serafina Morel now? We lose track of her last name, Solitaire answered. She's been married 3 times that I know of since I've been out. And I know she's been around longer than that. Her and Sorrow go way back. Weren't they an item once? Bethany asked. From the look of it, they still are, Anne snapped, and turned back for the house. Skye stood off to the side, watching the dancing and the musicians. He had noticed the governess in deep conversation with the twins, saw her distress, but not what had caused it. He was starting to go towards them when Liberty appeared in his way, smiling coyly up at him. "Aye, Miss O'Keefe?" he asked. "Or is it your highness tonight?" Her eyes flashed. "Liberty will do for now. Your majesty later." He swallowed. "What can I do for you, Miss Liberty? Spare a dance for your queen?" He blushed. "I've seen you dance, miss. I'll just embarrass you." She grabbed his arm and began pulling him out onto the floor. "I'll tone it down." She grinned. Skye found himself torn between wanting to run and hide and staying as physically close to her as he could manage. By the time he could make up his mind which was the stronger impulse, he was in the middle of the crowded dance floor, and the choice was moot. Anne found herself in front of one of the bonfires. She could not see it, but she stood there, soaking in the heat that was very different from the ambient swelter of the August night. She ignored everything around her for the most part, staring into the flames as if she could see them, wondering if she would be able to see it if they used a magical source to light one. Someone offered her a drink, but smelling the alcohol, she politely declined. Another individual came up behind her and accepted in her stead. This second person did not go away, but came up to stand at her elbow to watch the fire with her. She caught a glimpse of him from the corner of her eye and realized he was one of the changed. He was a short, stocky man, very much a long-fingered, walking badger. Even his face was that of a badger. He stood quietly, drinking from the bottle for a long moment before he ventured to speak. "You would be Miss Kilburn, would you not?" he asked in a quiet, infinitely polite voice. His accent was lightly Bostonian. "I would. And ye?" she asked with equal formality. "Danny O'Keefe, family builder." He did not offer to shake hands. In fact, he continued to mimic her position as long as she chose to not look directly at him. "I understand you pose a very particular challenge for me." "And what might that be?" He grinned. "Building a house you can see." This gave her pause. "And can you do such a thing? Build a house with magic in its very stones?" "It's only got to be lightly magic, right?" She turned to look at him, taking note of his waistcoat and the watch chain that ran from one side to the other of it. "Aye, I can tell that your vest is but lightly touched, magically coloured perhaps, but your watch is heavily of the other side." He ran his furred hand down his front and smiled. "'Twas only put together by magic, not a magic thread. So yeah, I can build you a house you can see, Miss Kilburn, and I shall take a great deal of delight in doing so. As for my watch..." He pulled it out of his pocket and held it out to her. "I found it on the way out. I'm quite fond of it." The moment it touched her hands, she knew things about it. Things that were not quite a whisper in the back of her mind, but almost. "And it is quite fond of you, Mr. O'Keefe. It helps you to work more quickly than others. Faster. Cleaner. And that hand you have no idea what it does? It marks the time you've left." He paled, accepting back the watch from her as she held it out. "Time I've left?" "Aye, on this earth. Unless something or someone interferes and takes you early, unless I misunderstand it. Your natural lifespan. I suggest you make the most of it." How do you know?" he stammered. She looked him over carefully. "It told me." "How?" She shook her head. "I don't know." Can you read other things this way? Mundane things? She thought about that, turned to face him. May I? She asked, holding out her hand. He readily nodded, and she reached out and touched the shoulder of his vest, stroking the fabric. Silky, pretty, aren't I fine? That is all your vest says to me. She figured the cloth of his sleeve, which she could not see, could tell that it was ordinary linen. This does not speak. He nodded, as if it all made perfect sense to him. Excellent. Well, if I find anything magical I don't understand, I now know who to ask, don't I? I would be pleased to be of some service. Now, you wished something of me? Yeah, your house. What kind would you like? She pulled back. Oh, I hardly qualify for my own home. I have no way yet to earn my keep. He grinned, showing a mouth full of badger teeth. Oh, something'll come along. Always does. Could take months. I seen folk come true took nearly a year to find their place. But boy, did they make up for it, he blushed. From the way he fidgeted when he said it, she guessed he was talking about himself. Besides, Ian said I was to build you one. So, what would you like? She did not have to think long on the matter. If I could have anything I wanted, I would like a small Irish cottage, a stone wall around, maybe a yard high, with roses and ivy and those lovely blooms that hang from the veranda of the main house. I love their smell. I'd build a small garden in the back, preferably with a small stream running through the bottom of the garden, maybe trees. But I will settle for something small and modest. I understand there are apartments here. He shook his head. Yeah, we have an apartment complex for those what like that sort of living, but you're not getting a place at the Unicorn Arms. I was told to build you a house. You sure you don't want anything bigger? I just finished Liberty's, and it's a 2-story, 4-bedroom with a cellar and an attic big enough to convert to a living space. I'm fine with something small. I have small needs. A sitting room with windows overlooking the garden, a modest kitchen, and a bedroom is all I need. He began sketching something down on a pad he pulled out of his pocket. You know, I think I got just the spot, too. What kind of trees? Old ones? I like fruit trees. If I have the space, I'll likely put down raspberries or blackberry canes, herbs and some flowers. A bit of a vegetable garden for myself, and I can get the seed. Nothing extravagant. I'm no farmer, just a country lass what misses home. He tucked his pad away again, reached out to shake her hand. Oh, mind the claws, he warned, taking her hand more gingerly than normal folk. I promise you'll be absolutely delighted or your money back, guaranteed. Now, if you will, she paled. I haven't any money. I've told you, I've no means. He laughed. Don't fret, pet. It's just a saying, a way of speaking. It's Ian's money regardless, and not much of that. I have plans for this house. This will be my masterpiece, a work of art. He beamed. He was so worked up at the prospect of the project that she hadn't the heart to call him off. He wandered off looking for someone else, and Anne finally turned and used Capine to return to the house. Danny took several minutes winding through the crowds before he found who he was looking for, the man in the kilt. He was with Liberty on the dance floor. He waited only long enough for the last strain of the song to start before he cut in. "Cousin!" he exclaimed, kissing both Liberty's cheeks and ignoring the look she was giving him. He turned to Skye. "And the man I've been looking for." "You have?" he asked, eyebrows raised. "Oh, yes, indeedy. Danny O'Keefe, family builder," he said, thrusting out his hand. "Mind the claws," he warned as Skye hesitantly reached out. As they were shaking, it suddenly pinged in Skye's mind who the man was and why he would be looking for him. "Ah!" Danny grinned. "Good, you know what's up. Shall we go discuss the particulars?" Liberty looked down at her watch and growled. She grabbed Skye's arm. "You'll have to wait until after the awards. I've got to go present, and this lad's been in so many contests today, he's bound to end up with one or two." She left neither man room to argue and dragged them back to the dance area and the short stage that had been set up for the band. Henry was already there, waiting, getting the results from the various judges. Liberty dropped Skye and her cousin off by her father and headed to the stage. Ian glanced over at the two of them, nodded, turned back to the stage and frowned. "You know, Danny, I think I ought to invest in a permanent stage or bandstand," Ian began. "We used to have a gazebo thing over yon, last century, I think it was. Hurricane took it out. Or was that a tornado? I forget." Beside him, Gabby snorted. "You forget?" "Old man brain," he growled in response. Skye did his best not to chuckle. Ian gave him a sidelong glance which helped his self-control immensely, and then Henry had taken the mic and begun his announcements. Anne quietly dressed herself for bed. She set her clothes in the hamper Shannon had thoughtfully provided, and was about to slip in between the sheets when there was a knock on her door. She paused, felt for the chair over which she had hung her dressing gown, and slipping into it, cracked the door open. It was Liberty. Anne let her in. "What can I do for you, Liberty?" she asked softly. "You can sit down and tell me why you left early," Liberty answered, not unkindly. Anne sighed, made a precise turn, and crossed to the wicker wing-back chair in the corner. It was yet another addition by the head housekeeper when it was noticed how much she enjoyed the one in the solar. She indicated for Liberty to take the other chair by the desk. Liberty closed the bedroom door and pulled the indicated seat over to face Anne's, and sat down, waiting. Anne nestled herself back in the comfort of the chintz-cushioned back, her hand unconsciously drifting over to stroke the intricate details of the carved box on the stand next to it. "I became overwhelmed." Liberty sighed. "Roulette and solitaire told me what happened with Serafina." Anne's reaction was sharp and quick. They should have kept their comments regarding my reactions to Master Sora to themselves. Her cheeks had flared a dark red. Liberty started to soften and bend, sorry she had offended, but quickly stiffened up, looking more the queen than she had in a while. "I understand about privacy and your Victorian sensibilities, but they've not gossiped it across the rest nor to anyone else. They care about you and what happens to you, as do I. When you missed the award ceremony, they brought the matter up to me. Roulette's the one said she thought she knew the cause, and there are things you need to know." Anne simmered down, took a deep breath, her thumb stroking a small carved hummingbird in a corner of the box. She calmed. "Very well. What?" "Unfortunately, some of them aren't my place to tell. But Serafina, she's a right black widow, that one. I don't understand what's between them, but something is. And you can't blame a man for straying when that woman is involved any more than you could blame—" She struggled for an analogy and had trouble coming up with one with names. "Well, the tales are full of sorceresses what stole another's man through magic. That's her." Anne shook her head. "It's no matter. I've no right to set my heart for him in any case. I haven't, and I won't." Liberty laughed. "You think your heart'll give you that option? You're more naive than I thought, then. And what do you mean you've no right? You've every right." Anne was adamant. "Nay, 'tis only heartbreak there. A governess might look to the servants for her heart's ease, or a farmer, or a small landsman or craftsman, but never to the Lord or his like." Liberty softened, slid her chair closer, set her hand on Anne's. "Ah, love, you're not the governess any longer. We're not a class-based society anymore, and you've every right to set your heart for any you like. Even my father, should you choose, though I don't recommend it." She gave a small smile in spite of her shock. "'Tis a hard thing to reconcile." "Aye, there's a lot of adjusting to do. You've more to do than most." "I had accepted the fact that love for me was unwise and not to be. I don't even know if this is the case here, just that—" "Seeing him with her hurt?" She raised a knowing eyebrow. Anne nodded. "I don't understand it." Liberty leaned back. "You've just met him. He's swept you off your feet and left you breathless. He's done nothing improper," Anne was quick to add. She smiled. "Nor will he. He'll be as proper as you like him to be, or as improper. But he's knocked the wind out of your sails nonetheless. There's a chance. Then you see evidence he's either courting another or is plain spoken for. It's a shock that things weren't what you expected. It's going to hurt. But what do I do? You just go on as before. Then, when it seems right, or you decide you really need the answers, you ask him. He'll answer or he won't, and that's the way of it." Anne frowned. "And how will I know he's not lying to me? All men lie and all men cheat. It's just what they do. I can accept that, was raised to the expectation, but I won't be the one he cheats with." Liberty didn't know which statement to address first. "Wow, all right. One, not all men lie or cheat, and I feel sorry for whoever taught you that." She shook it off. "Though I suppose in your day. As for Johnny lying, to put it baldly, he can't. Not won't. Can't. He's under a geas or summit." Anne seemed to shrink into herself at that. I thank you for coming to see to my well-being. I appreciate the concern. I'll manage. Thank you. If you're sure. I have better self-control than folk give me credit for, she smiled. I've been taking care of myself for a long time now, though it is wearing on me at the moment that I can't. I can understand that. I'll keep an eye out for something. Oh, I nearly forgot why I realized you left early. She pulled something out of her pocket and placed it into Ann's hands. Your reward for the Bardic contest. Anne looked up in shock from the small book in her hand. I won? Placed second. But the twins are hard to beat when they work together. I'll have to get the dancing as a separate contest next time around. It's not fair. She blushed, sat back and ran her hands over the soft leather cover, felt the tooled indentation of a spiraling triskelion on its face, but nothing else. What is the title? She asked, sadly realizing it couldn't be in Braille from the thinness of the book. Liberty laughed. No title but what you give it, love. It's a blank book. Glamour it so you can see it, then you put your thoughts into it. Or more poetry, that'd be nice. Write me something happy. Or at the least hopeful. Anne flushed further. I can't begin to thank you enough. Psst, she clucked. Don't thank me. You won it, fair and square. Johnny picked the prizes. We had something for each type of art, depending on what won. Which tells us we should have individual contests. Anne was so overwhelmed by the idea, the crisp blankness of the book, by the smell of the leather and clean pages, and the faint crack and creak of its spine as she opened it for the first time, that she did not hear Liberty take her leave. She rose, crossed to the desk, and sat down. Never once did it click that the chair should still have been in the corner, not at the desk. She took up the pen that she had glamoured to write Reggie's elegy, and opened to the first page, letting the words flow from her to the paper. It was a sweet little piece, something akin to a lullaby. She felt slightly drained when she was done, but then she often did after writing. It was a release. She blew on the page to dry the ink out of habit, and closed the book. She put the pen in its place and set the book on top of the Braille books on the back corner of the desk, then thought better of it. She rose and crossed back to the small table beside her wing-back chair by the window and opened the box that had contained the children's gifts. The book nestled quite nicely inside it. She closed the lid and crossed the room, slipping out of her dressing gown and into the bed, ready to sleep in spite of the sounds of revelry still flowing through the open window. The smells of the fires lulled her, providing comfort without the extra heat she could not have withstood at the moment. She was asleep immediately. Anne rose the next morning and went about her day as if the events of the night before had not occurred. She breakfasted with the family and the other taken who currently resided in the house, of which there were only 4. There was Skye, of course, a handsome young selkie who filled the air with the aroma of salt seas, making Anne feel inexplicably homesick. The other 2 were a gnomish engineer who was moving out that day to work in the wide world beyond for Danny's construction company, and a frog boy who kept using his tongue to grab whatever he could not reach at the table. The latter had not yet acquired a fully human form and was struggling with the concept of needing to have his curse broken. At the end of breakfast, as she was taking out the plates, Shannon remarked to Ian, I'll take that one under wing if you need, sir. I'll do for him what I did with that lost boy you brought through in '86.
And you did right well by him, if memory serves, Shannon. What was that he's doing now? You're still in touch, eh?
She gave him a reproving look as she stacked his plate on top of the others in her grasp. Of course I am. Philip is teaching literature at NYU at the moment. Got his tenure last year.
Good. Have at this one,
he said with a baleful glare in the frog boy's direction. The young man visibly wilted. It made following Shannon the preferred course, and the 2 of them headed out, with the boy carrying a tray with the cups and silver. From breakfast, Anne went to the solar to work on her crochet, whilst the rest of the family went to Mass. She was asked if she'd like to attend, to which she politely declined, and, surprisingly, no one pressed or asked her to explain. She sat in her chair for hours, working on her lace, listening to the various people who came and went throughout the day after church. A great many paused to congratulate her on her success the night before, which both pleased and embarrassed her to no end. No one mentioned either Johnny or Seraphina, for which she was grateful. Liberty came round for supper with the family, and Anne was pleased to show her what she had written. She fetched the book and handed it to her as they sat in the solar after the meal with coffee, whilst the others watched whatever game was on the television in the next room. Liberty opened the book and began flipping pages. Wow, did you sleep at all? You wrote all this in one night? Some of these are amazing. The well-turned phrase, like the turning moon, waxes and wanes in its light, brighter and brighter like a candle whose flame burns from both ends of the wick, she read. Breathtaking. Anne frowned. What? I didn't write that last night. I wrote that. She leaned over to look at the book. Years ago. Over there. She fell silent as she noticed the hand in which the pages and pages of poetry were written. Liberty handed her the book and watched her face as she turned page after page. Anne sat down. The first was written in her own hand, with the modern ink pen she had used last night. The rest were in the hand of the young prince, though far neater than she remembered, in the flowing strokes of his swan feather quill and fay flower ink, which was faintly purple in the right light. I don't understand. Don't understand what? Did you sleep right? She shook her head. No, I wrote these whilst I was in service. I left them behind, not intentional, mind, but nonetheless. Liberty thought out loud. Where'd you set the book? Mayhap some brownie did you a favour? Brownies are a Scottish sprite, Anne frowned, and 'tis the young prince's hand. What, you think that just 'cause they're Scot we don't have one or two lurking? We call them by other names, but they be brownies all the same. Well enough, but they were in the box the king... Anne stopped. She only thought a moment more before she darted upstairs, letting Capine keep her out of trouble. She was aware Liberty was following her, so she left the door open. She picked up the box and thought about it, felt the box respond, insinuating the understanding of what she wanted to know without speaking. She sank into her chair by the window with it on her lap. Well? Liberty asked. There was a smile of wonder and love on Anne's face. It's a... Well, I put things into it, and they go there, to the children, and vice versa. Clever. And the poems? I guess the prince found it and thought... The book in her hand corrected this impression. No, it was taken from the box. The prince loved the poem. The princess remembered my old collection and fetched it. She read them out, and the young prince copied them with great care. Explains why they're in Irish. Anne decided she would pen a letter before bed. It would take careful crafting to thank them without thanking them. She rose, set the book beside the box to remind herself, and followed Liberty back downstairs to the solar. She had crochet to put away, and she was not yet ready to retire. She thought about taking a walk in the lovely twilight. The gloaming still came late and lingered long, and the mists would be rising from the river. Before she could ask Liberty if she would like to join her, a man ran in the front door, saw Liberty, and skidded to a halt. Where's your da? The two women paused on the stairs in confusion. His study, I think, she stammered.
No,
Ian said, stepping out of the living room.
I'm in here watching the bloody telly. What's the rush, Sean? Aren't you supposed to be watching the Tallow Girl?
Sean took a moment to catch his breath. Jacob's on it now. I had to leave. Was seen. Jacob can watch without being seen at all.
Activity?
Asked Ian calmly, leaning against the doorframe. Sean nodded. Night hag this time. Had two hobs with her. We got them, but we're going to have to do something. We can't keep watch like this forever.
I know, but what else can we do? We have to protect her. She's not one of us, but she will be if we don't take steps.
I agree, Sean said. 'Tis rare for magic to show up this strongly and this young without a legacy being involved. Legacy? Liberty asked. Sean looked up at her, took his hat in his hand. Aye, Miss O'Keefe. A family line where this happens more often than not. In which case, they're trained from an early age and we don't get this sort of problem. This child is what I'd suppose you'd call a muggle-born, he said with a wry smile, if it helps to use those terms. Liberty nodded. Actually, that does clear it up for me. It still leaves me in the dark, Anne ventured, providing the conversation isn't a private one. Ian looked up to the staircase and a strange look crossed his eyes. He stood and moved forward.
Actually, let's call it private and take this to my office.
Sean nodded and turned down the appropriate hallway immediately. Anne bobbed a brief curtsy and continued down the stairs, preparing to cross to the solar to put away her lace. Ian stopped her with a hand in her way.
If you'll be so kind, Miss Kilburn, as to follow Sean?
Anne looked up, confused, but nodded.
Liberty, will you be joining us or heading home?
Something out on the darkening lawn caught her eye, and she smiled, spoke without turning to her father. Oh, I think I'll walk home. I'll read the new poem later if you'll let me. You have a good night. Good night, she murmured in confused response. She allowed Ian to take her arm and escort her down the hallway to his office, while Liberty stalked out the front door with a determined look on her face. In the office, Sean pulled out the chair for An, seating himself on the couch. Ian dropped into his chair and lit up a cigarette, tossing one to Sean.
I wanted a cigarette anyhow.
Now, he said, lighting up.
Please to explain to Miss An who you are and what the situation is.
Sean took in the expression on Ian's face and then turned to An, studying her a long moment before he lifted the cigarette to his lips and snapped his fingers in a manner that reminded An of the lighters modern men use to light their tobacco. Though there was no lighter in his hand, a small flame burst into existence between his thumb and forefinger. He drew in, and when the cigarette was properly glowing, opened his palm outward to show her there was no fire and no source. An watched the process, less impressed than she felt she should be. She looked back at Ian, feet propped up on the edge of his invisible desk, watching her with care and amusement, then back at Sean. She studied him more closely. She was certain there was more here than taken tricks. She had seen Fox light his habit with his finger before, so that wasn't it. She could see him clearly, if a bit shimmery, as she could any of the touched. And then she realized he wasn't touched at all. There was a particular resonance to the touched, a duality to them, being both real and of Faery. There was nothing of that in this man. Her sight of him was straightforward and clear, wholly of this world. The magic which she saw him through was all of this world, and almost more real than her own. It was also a great deal less confined or defined. "You're a dree!" He laughed at her surprise. I am a wizard, so to speak. I work my will on the universe. He held out his hand. Sean O'Keefe. An accepted it, introduced herself. There was only a flicker of amusement at her name, but unless you were looking for it, it would never be noticed. He got right to business. As I was telling Miss O'Keefe, Elizabeth Tallow is a dree, as you said, as well. But she is only 9. She's come into her power this young in a household of people who have no idea what their daughter is. Were she a legacy, she would be taught how to use and shield her powers so that others would not realize what she is and come hunting her before she's able, if she ever will be, to defend herself. As it is, we have to watch the house every night and fight off the various monsters of all supernatural bents who are drawn to her power like a moth to a flame. I had to kill a vampire last week. The problem lies in keeping her safe whilst her parents remain clueless. She's seeing things they can't, but some of us can. An mused quietly, her hand sitting primly in her lap. Her voice was soft when she spoke. A child with such an active imagination would benefit from special attentions. How's her schoolwork? Ian grinned. Sean's face went momentarily blank, then it was his turn to light up in surprised realization. You're... He looked at Ian. Is she... Ian shrugged, waved his cigarette hand dismissively.
She's not got the certification she needs to teach school these days, but she's the skills.
Sean looked back at her. I was under the impression you were from the late 1800s. How well versed are you in modern teaching? Have mathematics changed that much? Reading? What I don't know I can learn, quicker than the child, likely. My problem will be knowing if she's getting things right. I can't exactly see her writing, and I'm blind as far as normals understand, she added as she thought things through. She looked over at Ian. I see what you're doing, and it won't work. I'm blind. No one will hire a blind governess, fey-touched or no. Ian's grin was smug.
Oh, I can weave a reason so sound they'd be false to refuse it. There are reasons for you to be there other than teaching. Sean, you've a friend at the school board, eh?
Sean nodded.
See and you can get her transcripts. See where she's lacking. Give me a back door.
I'll get right to work. Find a guidance counsellor's reason for the intervention.
And then I'll sweep in to the rescue with Miss Kyobrin here. That is, if she'll take the job, he added, turning to her.
What exactly will be expected of me?
First and foremost, keep the child safe, Ian responded. We need someone what can see the dangers who can notify us should there be somewhat needing discouragement. Second, guide her along. Help her to get her powers under control. You've taught magical children afore. Do what you did for them.
But I couldn't teach them how to use their powers, she protested. That's what I'm for, Sean interrupted. Ian put his feet down and leaned forward on the desk.
You taught them when to use their powers and for why. Thanks to you, we have 3 less Tuatha likely to snatch people and alter them for their own amusement. 3 less looking at us as toys to be played with, broken and cast aside, and 3 more allies against those what do.
Anne took a deep breath. A purpose at last, she thought. She sat up straighter, one hand settled on Capine's knob confidently. 1, where will I be staying and what will be done on my days off, as I'll need at least 1 a month. 2, I'll be needing to learn to battle these beasties, in case one slips into the house afore help can come. You'll likely be staying with the Talos, Sean answered. We need you on premises at night. Maybe after a few months they'll get the hint that she's guarded and you can relax your watch of her.
I'll have one teach you to use that twig you're so fond of.
Ian grinned.
He knows a few special tricks for stakes.
Sean frowned. He doesn't teach weapon styles. Says they're for the weak.
Ian chuckled. He'll teach her. One could argue she is weak. He turned back to her. As for days off, I'm sure we can manage 2 nights of the old watches a week.
Anne was startled. 2 nights off a week? Sir, that's outrageous. They'll never go for it.
Sean laughed. They'd ask too many questions if you asked for less.
Anne flushed, made once again aware of just how out of time she was. Well, I should still remain there 6 nights a week for a month or 2, until things settle a little. Ian shrugged when Sean looked over at him.
Might work. Be a good idea regardless. We'll get her IDs claiming her an Irish au pair. Rowdy should be able to handle the paperwork. He has an act for making papers no one takes too close a look at.
Very well, then. I suppose someone should tell Danny that I shan't be needing the house after all.
Ian chuckled. Oh, I'll not be the one to break his heart. You'll be needing it in any case. You'll have time off and I'll need a place to spend it.
He narrowed his eyes as she started to protest, and she closed her mouth.
I'll let you know as soon as we're ready to present you. You'll have to fill the child in on everything. She's met us before. She'll be delighted with you.
Sean frowned. Might want to get her a better name, though, he mused. Aunt Kilburn isn't exactly normal. That and no middle name. The right corner of Ian's mouth twitched smileward.
Well, I suppose I could adopt her, and she'd be willing, afford her the protections.
It's what I was thinking, Sean agreed. If she deals with Hobbs or other fey things, they won't be able to snatch her and leave the child helpless. Anne watched the 2 men talk about her as if she wasn't even in the room. If they were hoping to use this to get a rise out of her, they were disappointed. It was something she was used to. Ian finally turned to her.
Well, lass, you interested?
The job or the surname?
Both. Either.
Well, since you're asking direct, she said with an infuriating, prim calm. I and I. Ian grinned, leaning back in his chair, took a long, slow drag from his cigarette. Sean sank back against the couch as if a great weight had suddenly been lifted. Even Anne underwent a small change, though there was no outward indication. Purpose settled into her every pore, suffusing her with a sense of calm and rightness.